The courthouse records in Cumberland County, North Carolina, tell a story that local officials tried desperately to bury for over a century. Between 1832 and 1839, 7 young women vanished without a trace from the same rural community, all sharing one disturbing connection: they had recently given birth. What authorities discovered in the spring of 1839 would shake the foundations of polite society and reveal a web of deception so elaborate that even today, historians debate whether the full truth ever came to light. The case of Mercy and Charity Goodwin would expose not just one man's twisted obsession, but an entire network of corruption that reached from the humblest farmhouse to the most prestigious families in the state. Before we continue with the story of the Goodwin sisters and the man who would destroy their lives, we need you to be part of our community of truth seekers. Subscribe to Liturgy of Fear and hit that notification bell so you never miss these forgotten tales of American darkness. And tell us in the comments, what state are you listening from? We love connecting with fellow mystery enthusiasts across the country. The spring of 1839 would prove that sometimes the most beautiful facades hide the most horrifying secrets, and that in the rural corners of North Carolina, justice moved slowly while evil flourished in plain sight. The rolling hills of Cumberland County had always been kind to those willing to work its red clay soil. By 1839, the region had grown prosperous from tobacco cultivation and the steady flow of merchants traveling between Fayetteville and the western settlements. It was a place where family names carried weight, where a man's word was his bond, and where young women of good breeding could expect to marry well if they possessed both beauty and virtue. Mercy and Charity Goodwin possessed both in abundance. At 22 years of age, the identical twins were renowned throughout the county for their striking appearance. Cascading auburn hair that caught the light like burnished copper, eyes the color of winter moss, and features so perfectly symmetrical that strangers often stopped mid-conversation simply to stare. Born to respected landowners who had built their fortune through careful investments in both property and reputation, the sisters had been raised with all the advantages their station could provide. But death has no regard for social standing. The yellow fever epidemic of 1837 had swept through the region like a scythe through wheat, claiming both parents within a week of each other. The family's debts, carefully hidden behind a veneer of prosperity, came due with shocking swiftness. The tobacco fields, the elegant house with its wide front porch and hand-carved railings, even their mother's jewelry. Everything was sold to satisfy creditors who showed no mercy for 2 grieving young women. By the winter of 1838, Mercy and Charity found themselves living in a cramped boarding house room above Hensley's general store, surviving on the meager wages Charity earned, teaching the children of local farmers to read and write. Mercy, whose constitution had always been more delicate, struggled to find work that wouldn't compromise their remaining shred of respectability. The twins had learned a harsh lesson that many women of their era knew all too well. Beauty and breeding meant nothing without the protection of male guardianship and financial security. It was during this period of desperate uncertainty that Jeremiah Whitlow entered their lives like an answer to prayer. Whitlow was everything the sisters needed in a potential suitor: wealthy, established, and seemingly kind. At 38, he had never married, which he explained away with charming self-deprecation about being too particular and too devoted to building his commercial empire. His trading company, Whitlow and Associates, had made him one of the most prosperous men in the county through shrewd investments in tobacco, cotton, and the growing railroad connections that were transforming North Carolina's economy. He was not conventionally handsome. His features were too sharp, his frame too lean, and his pale blue eyes had an intensity that some found unsettling. But he dressed impeccably, spoke with the refined accent of an educated gentleman, and possessed the kind of easy confidence that comes with substantial wealth. Most importantly for the Goodwin sisters, he seemed genuinely interested in their welfare during a time when most men of his standing wouldn't even acknowledge their reduced circumstances. Whitlow's courtship was both persistent and peculiar. He would arrive at the boarding house with expensive gifts, bolt after bolt of the finest silk, imported perfumes that cost more than most families earned in a month, jewelry that sparkled with genuine gems. But he seemed unable to choose between the sisters, lavishing equal attention on both with an intensity that bordered on obsession. "You are perfection made manifest," he told them during one particularly fervent visit, his pale eyes moving between their faces as if trying to memorize every detail. Nature has never created anything so flawless, so absolutely without flaw or imperfection. The twins found his devotion flattering, but increasingly uncomfortable. There was something in the way he looked at them, not as individuals, but as objects to be possessed and displayed. When he proposed marriage in the spring of 1839, he made an unusual request that should have served as a warning. "I cannot choose between such identical perfection," he declared, taking both their hands in his. "Providence has blessed me with enough wealth to provide for both of you. Mercy, you shall be my wife in the eyes of God and the law. Charity, you shall be my wife in the eyes of my heart. We shall be a family bound not by convention, but by mutual devotion and practical necessity." The arrangement he proposed was unconventional, but not unheard of in rural communities where economic survival often trumped social propriety. Polygamy was illegal, but many households included unmarried sisters or cousins of the wife, especially when financial circumstances demanded it. Whitlow assured them that Charity would be treated with all the respect and comfort of a true wife, lacking only the legal status that would belong to Mercy alone. For two women facing destitution, the offer seemed like a miracle. They would live in comfort at Whitlow's expansive estate, Rosemont, with its 40-room mansion and sprawling grounds. They would want for nothing, and perhaps most importantly, they would remain together during uncertain times. Neither sister noticed the collection of miniature portraits that adorned Whitlow's study, each depicting a beautiful young woman with the same general coloring and features. Neither questioned why a man of his wealth and standing had remained unmarried for so long. And neither understood that they had just agreed to enter a nightmare that had already claimed 7 other innocent lives. The wedding took place on a humid morning in June 1839, with only the local minister and 2 witnesses present. Whitlow had insisted on a simple ceremony, explaining that elaborate celebrations would only draw unwanted attention to their unconventional arrangement. The ceremony itself felt rushed and strangely impersonal, with Whitlow reciting his vows while staring at some point just beyond Mercy's shoulder, as if he were addressing someone who wasn't quite there. Rosemont proved to be even more magnificent than the sisters had imagined. Built in the federal style with soaring columns and intricate millwork, the mansion sat on a rise overlooking thousands of acres of productive farmland. The interior was furnished with pieces imported from Europe, mahogany furniture that gleamed like dark mirrors, Persian carpets that felt like silk beneath their feet, and crystal chandeliers that cast rainbow fragments across walls covered in hand-painted silk wallpaper. But for all its grandeur, Rosemont felt oddly impersonal. The rooms were beautifully appointed but sterile, as if they were designed to be admired rather than lived in. There were no family portraits, no personal mementos, nothing that spoke of the man who supposedly called this place home. Even Whitlow's own bedroom was spartanly furnished, containing only the essentials and nothing that might reveal his personality or history. The household staff consisted of an elderly housekeeper named Mrs. Donovan, whose Irish accent was so thick the sisters often struggled to understand her, and 2 young maids who seemed perpetually nervous and rarely spoke above a whisper. There was also a groundskeeper named Samuel, who lived in a cottage near the stables and communicated primarily through nods and gestures. All of them had been with Whitlow for less than 2 years, having replaced previous staff who had, according to Mrs. Donovan, found employment elsewhere quite suddenly. The first months of marriage passed in a blur of luxury and growing unease. Whitlow was an attentive husband to both sisters, though his affections felt rehearsed, as if he were playing a role rather than expressing genuine emotion. He would spend hours simply watching them as they read or sewed, his pale eyes tracking their every movement with an intensity that made them feel like specimens under glass. "You must maintain your perfection," he would remind them constantly. "Perfect posture, perfect complexion, perfect deportment. Nothing must mar your flawless beauty." He hired a French governess, Madame Rousseau, to refine their manners and speech. Even though both sisters had received excellent educations, he brought in a seamstress from Charleston to create an entire wardrobe of the finest gowns, all in shades that complemented their coloring. He even insisted they follow a specific daily routine designed to preserve their beauty. Morning walks at precisely 8 o'clock, afternoon rest periods to prevent fatigue lines, evening baths in imported milk and honey. The restrictions seemed caring at first, even flattering. But gradually, they began to feel like a cage decorated with silk and gold. By autumn, both sisters were pregnant. The news should have brought joy, but Whitlow's reaction was disturbing in its intensity. He became obsessed with every detail of their pregnancies, consulting constantly with Dr. Harrison Fletcher, a nervous man with thinning hair and hands that shook when he thought no one was watching. "The bloodline must be perfect," Whitlow told Dr. Fletcher during one particularly uncomfortable examination. "Any deviation, any imperfection cannot be tolerated." Dr. Fletcher would nod vigorously while adjusting his spectacles. "Of course, Mr. Whitlow, I understand completely. Everything will be managed appropriately." As their pregnancies progressed, the sisters began to notice disturbing details about their new home. Mercy discovered a locked room on the 3rd floor that Mrs. Donovan claimed was just storage, nothing to concern yourself with. Charity found gardening tools in the carriage house that were caked with what looked suspiciously like dried blood, though Samuel claimed they were used for slaughtering livestock despite the fact that Rosemont kept no animals other than horses. More troubling still were the dreams that began to plague both sisters. Nightmares of crying babies that seemed to come from within the walls themselves, of women calling for help from somewhere deep beneath the house. They would wake gasping and reach for each other across the space between their beds, finding comfort in the knowledge that they were experiencing the same disturbing visions. "It's just our condition making us nervous," Mercy would whisper, though her voice lacked conviction. Of course, Charity would agree, though she clutched her sister's hand like a lifeline. But the dreams weren't the worst part. The worst part was the growing certainty that they were being watched constantly, not just by Whitlow but by unseen eyes that seemed to peer at them from every shadow. The worst part was the realization that the magnificent rooms of Rosemont echoed strangely, as if there were spaces behind the walls where sound could travel freely. The worst part was the slowly dawning understanding that their husband's obsession with their perfection wasn't love. It was something far darker and more dangerous. On a cold December evening, as both sisters entered their final month of pregnancy, Charity made a discovery that would change everything. While exploring the library in search of something to read, she accidentally triggered a hidden mechanism behind one of the bookcases. The panel swung inward, revealing a narrow staircase that descended into darkness. Against every instinct for self-preservation, she lit a candle and began to descend. The stairs led to a cellar room that had been carved from the red clay beneath the house. And there, arranged on wooden shelves like trophies in a hunter's den, were the personal belongings of women who should have been alive but were nowhere to be found. A wedding dress of cream-colored silk, carefully preserved and smelling faintly of lavender. A pair of silver hairbrushes engraved with the initials MC. A leather journal filled with a woman's delicate handwriting, the entries ending abruptly in mid-sentence. A music box that played a haunting melody when wound, its tiny dancing figure wearing a gown identical to the one on the shelf. Item after item, belonging after belonging, each one telling the story of a life that had been carefully erased. As Charity's candle flickered in the damp air, she counted 7 distinct collections, 7 sets of personal effects that represented 7 women who had vanished from the world as completely as if they had never existed. At the far end of the room, scratched into the clay wall with what must have been fingernails, were names and dates. Margaret Crawford, 1832, Sarah Henley, 1833, Rebecca Patterson, 1834, Anna Louise Mackenzie, 1835, Catherine Vaughan, 1836, Eleanor Pierce, 1837, Helen Gardner, 1838, 7 names, 7 women. 7 wives who had shared Jeremiah Whitlow's bed and then disappeared after giving birth to his children. As the terrible truth settled over her like a shroud, Charity heard footsteps on the stairs above. Her husband's voice drifted down to her, calling her name with the same gentle tone he always used, as if he were summoning a beloved pet. "Charity, my perfect one, where have you wandered off to now?" The knowledge of what lay beneath Rosemont changed everything for the Goodwin sisters. Charity shared her horrifying discovery with Mercy that very night. Speaking in whispers while they huddled together in Mercy's bedroom, their growing bellies making the conversation feel even more urgent and desperate. "We have to leave," Mercy whispered, her hands protectively cradling her unborn child. "Tonight, before he realizes what you've found." But escape proved impossible. The next morning, they discovered that their movements were being carefully monitored. Samuel, the groundskeeper, seemed to appear wherever they went, always maintaining a respectful distance, but never quite out of sight. Mrs. Donovan suddenly became insistent on helping them with the most basic tasks, claiming concern for their delicate condition. Even Dr. Fletcher began making daily visits, ostensibly to monitor their health, but clearly serving as another set of eyes watching their every move. Whitlow himself became even more attentive, if such a thing were possible. He would sit with them for hours, reading aloud from books of poetry, or discussing plans for the nursery, all while his pale eyes moved constantly between their faces with that same disturbing intensity. When they mentioned feeling confined and expressed a desire to visit friends in town, he gently but firmly explained that such activities were too dangerous in their condition. "My perfect ones," he would say, his voice carrying the slightest edge beneath its cultured tones. "You must understand that your safety and the safety of our children are my paramount concerns. The roads are treacherous in winter, and there are influences in town that might disturb your delicate constitutions. Here at Rosemont, I can ensure that nothing threatens your well-being or perfection." The sisters began to understand that they were prisoners in their gilded cage, but they also realized that any dramatic attempt at escape would likely result in their immediate disposal. Instead, they began to plan carefully, gathering information and looking for opportunities while maintaining the facade of devoted wives. Charity returned to the hidden cellar whenever possible, studying the belongings of Whitlow's previous victims and trying to piece together their stories. Margaret Crawford's journal proved particularly illuminating. The entries painted a picture disturbingly similar to their own experience. February 15th, 1832. Jeremiah continues to be the most devoted husband. Sometimes I feel his attention is almost too intense, as if he's studying me rather than simply enjoying my company. But perhaps I am being foolish. What woman wouldn't want such dedication? April 3rd, 1832. I am with child. Jeremiah's joy is beyond description, though he speaks constantly of the need for the baby to be perfect. He has engaged a physician from Raleigh who asks the most peculiar questions about my family's health history. June 20th, 1832. Dr. Stevens examined me again today. I overheard him speaking with Jeremiah about contingency plans and alternative arrangements. When I asked what they meant, Jeremiah assured me they were simply discussing preparations for a difficult birth. But why would that require such secrecy? August 10th, 1832. I have been having the strangest dreams about crying children and women calling for help. Jeremiah says it's common for women in my condition to have disturbing dreams, but these feel so real. Sometimes I wake feeling certain there are other people in the house, people I've never met. The entries ended there, in mid-August. If Margaret Crawford had given birth at full term, her child would have been born in October or November. But there was no record of what happened to either mother or baby. While Charity researched their predecessors' fates, Mercy began paying closer attention to the household dynamics. She noticed that Dr. Fletcher always arrived with a leather bag that seemed unusually heavy for simple medical equipment. She observed that Mrs. Donovan received frequent visitors, rough-looking men who arrived after dark and left before dawn. Most disturbing of all, she realized that Samuel wasn't just a groundskeeper. He was watching the roads, noting everyone who passed by, and reporting regularly to Whitlow about any strangers in the area. The sisters also began to understand the full scope of their isolation. Rosemont was situated on a vast tract of land with no near neighbors. The closest house was over 3 miles away, belonging to an elderly widow who rarely ventured out. The main road to Fayetteville passed nearly 2 miles from the mansion, making it impossible for casual travelers to notice anything unusual. Whitlow had chosen his location carefully, ensuring that whatever happened at Rosemont would remain hidden from the outside world. As January turned to February and their due dates approached, the sisters' desperation grew. They attempted to send a letter to Charity's former employer in town, but discovered that all outgoing mail was being intercepted. They tried to convince one of the maids to carry a message, only to learn that the young women were too terrified of Whitlow to risk his displeasure. Even their attempts to gather supplies for a potential escape were thwarted when they discovered that their access to money, warm clothing, and transportation had been quietly but thoroughly restricted. It became clear that Whitlow's control over Rosemont was absolute. He had created a perfect prison where his victims could be kept comfortable and compliant until they had served their purpose. The luxury that had initially seemed like generosity was revealed to be a sophisticated trap, designed to make escape seem not just difficult, but unthinkable. The breaking point came on a bitter February night when Mercy went into labor 3 weeks early. As her contractions intensified, she was moved to a specially prepared room that the sisters had never seen before, a sterile, whitewashed chamber in the mansion's east wing that looked more like a hospital than a bedroom. Dr. Fletcher arrived within an hour, accompanied by 2 assistants whose faces they didn't recognize and whose medical credentials were never mentioned. As Mercy's labor progressed through the night, Charity was banished to an adjacent room where she could hear her sister's cries, but could offer no comfort. Through the thin walls, she could also hear conversations between Dr. Fletcher and his assistants that filled her with mounting dread. The specimen appears to be developing normally, no obvious defects or abnormalities. And the mother's condition? Strong enough for the delivery, but we'll follow the usual protocol afterward. Mr. Whitlow has been very specific about the timeline. The arrangements for transport? All prepared. The contact in Wilmington is expecting delivery within the week. Charity pressed her ear to the wall, her heart racing as she began to understand what was being discussed. These men weren't just doctors. They were part of a carefully organized operation that treated both mothers and babies as commodities to be processed and distributed. Just before dawn, Mercy's cries suddenly stopped. Dr. Fletcher emerged from the birthing chamber, his face grim and his hands bloodied. He spoke briefly with Whitlow in hushed tones before approaching Charity with the devastating news. "I'm terribly sorry," he said, his eyes unable to meet hers. "The baby was stillborn, and your sister, the complications were too severe. She passed peacefully just a few minutes ago." But Charity had heard no baby's cries, and more importantly, she had heard Mercy calling her name just moments before the sudden silence. Her sister hadn't died peacefully, she had died calling for help that never came. As the shocking reality of her situation crashed over her, Charity understood that she was now completely alone with a man who had murdered her sister and stolen her child. And her own baby was due to be born within days. The game was no longer about escape. It was about survival. The days following Mercy's supposed death passed in a haze of grief and terror for Charity. Whitlow played the role of the bereaved widower with disturbing conviction, arranging a funeral service that drew sympathetic neighbors from across the county. The closed coffin was buried in the Rosemont family cemetery with full honors, complete with a granite headstone bearing Mercy's name and dates. But Charity knew the truth. Late at night, when the house was supposedly asleep, She could hear sounds from the cellar that no amount of grief could explain away. Muffled voices, footsteps, and most horrifying of all, the distant sound of an infant crying. Her sister's baby was alive, and quite possibly, so was Mercy herself. The realization that Whitlow was keeping his victims alive, at least temporarily, added new dimensions of horror to her situation. Death, it seemed, was not the immediate fate of his wives. Something far worse awaited them in the depths, beneath Rosemont. Dr. Fletcher continued his daily visits, ostensibly to monitor Charity's health as she grieved and prepared for her own delivery. But his examinations had taken on a clinical detachment that made her skin crawl. He no longer spoke to her as a patient. He observed her like a livestock breeder evaluating breeding stock. "The subject is responding well to the stress," she overheard him telling Whitlow after one particularly invasive examination. "The pregnancy appears unaffected by the recent trauma. We should expect normal delivery within the week." "And the transport arrangements?" Whitlow inquired. "Confirmed. The contact in Charleston has expressed particular interest in this specimen due to the twin genetics. The buyer is offering a premium price." "Excellent. And the other matter?" "The facility in Wilmington is prepared for long-term housing. The previous subject has adapted well to the new environment, and the infant has been successfully placed with the family in Virginia." Charity felt her blood turn to ice as she processed what she was hearing. Mercy was alive, imprisoned somewhere called the facility in Wilmington, while her baby had been sold to strangers in Virginia. The entire operation was far more extensive than she had imagined, involving multiple locations and what sounded like a network of buyers and sellers trafficking in human beings. As her own labor approached, Charity made a desperate decision. If she couldn't escape before giving birth, she would have to find a way to expose Whitlow's crimes from within the system. But first, she needed proof that would convince the outside world. Over the next several nights, she began a dangerous campaign of espionage within her own home. Using her knowledge of the house's hidden passages, she explored areas that had previously been off-limits, gathering evidence of Whitlow's operation. In his study, she discovered a ledger book that recorded transactions in a simple but damning code. Specimen MC, delivered February 1832, subject Wilmington, product Richmond, payment $800. Specimen SH, delivered March 1833, subject Charleston, product Savannah, payment $950. Specimen RP, delivered January 1834, subject Norfolk, product Baltimore, payment $1,100. The pattern was clear and horrifying. Specimen referred to the mothers, who were delivered to various locations after giving birth. Product referred to the babies, who were sold to buyers in different cities. The payments increased over time, suggesting that Whitlow's operation was becoming more sophisticated and profitable. Even more damning was a collection of correspondence hidden behind a false back in his desk drawer. Letters from contacts in Charleston, Wilmington, Norfolk, and other coastal cities detailed the specific requirements of their clientele. Some buyers wanted children for adoption by wealthy families who couldn't have their own. Others sought young women for purposes that weren't explicitly stated, but could be easily inferred from the coded language. The most chilling discovery was a letter dated just 2 weeks earlier. "Jeremiah, the Charleston buyer has specifically requested twin stock if available. Premium payment of $2,000 for matched pair in good condition. The Richmond contact has expressed interest in the breeding potential of identical genetics. Advised timeline for next delivery. HM." The letter was signed with the initials HM and bore the letterhead of a company called Southern Maritime Trading based in Wilmington. Charity realized that Whitlow wasn't operating alone. He was part of a regional network that treated human beings as livestock to be bred, bought, and sold. As she photographed the documents with a small camera, she had found among the belongings in the cellar, apparently belonging to one of Whitlow's previous victims who had tried to gather similar evidence. Charity heard footsteps in the hallway outside the study. She quickly returned everything to its proper place and slipped back to her room through the hidden passages, her heart pounding with a mixture of terror and determination. The next morning, she made a calculated decision that would either save her life or end it immediately. During Dr. Fletcher's daily visit, she confronted him directly about what she had learned. "I know what you're doing," she said quietly, fixing him with a steady gaze that made him visibly uncomfortable. "I know about the facility in Wilmington, I know about the buyers in Charleston and Virginia, and I know my sister is still alive." Dr. Fletcher's face went white, and his hands began their familiar trembling. For a moment she thought he might simply deny everything, but instead he glanced nervously toward the door and then leaned closer to her bedside. "You don't understand," he whispered urgently. "This isn't... I never intended... Mr. Whitlow has certain leverage over my situation, my medical license, my family's reputation. He knows things that could destroy everything I've worked for." "What kind of leverage?" Charity pressed, sensing weakness in his confession. "Years ago, I made a mistake during a difficult surgery. A patient died due to my negligence, but Whitlow helped cover it up. He has documents, witnesses. He could ruin me with a single word to the medical board." Fletcher's voice broke with the weight of his confession. "I never wanted to be part of this, but once you're in Whitlow's web, there's no escape." Charity realized that Dr. Fletcher might be her only potential ally, a man trapped by blackmail rather than greed. But before she could explore this opportunity further, they heard Whitlow's footsteps approaching down the hallway. Fletcher immediately resumed his professional demeanor, but not before whispering a single word that would change everything. "Tonight." That evening, as Charity lay in her bed pretending to sleep, she heard Dr. Fletcher return to Rosemont. But instead of his usual medical bag, he carried something far more dangerous. A lantern, rope, and what appeared to be a small pistol tucked into his coat. The doctor had made his choice. The question now was whether he was coming to rescue her or to ensure her permanent silence. Dr. Fletcher's midnight return to Rosemont marked the beginning of the most dangerous hours of Charity's life. As she lay in her darkened bedroom, listening to whispered conversations echoing through the mansion's corridors, she realized that whatever was about to happen would determine not just her fate, but the fate of every woman who might fall into Whitlow's trap in the future. The conversations grew closer, and she could make out distinct voices. Fletcher's nervous whispers, Whitlow's calm commands, and a third voice she didn't recognize, deeper, rougher, with an accent that suggested origins far from North Carolina's educated society. "The timeline has been moved up," she heard Whitlow saying. "We need to complete the transfer tonight before complications arise." "But the subject isn't due for another 4 days," Fletcher protested. Inducing labor prematurely could result in complications that would reduce the value of the product. "The product's value is secondary to operational security," the stranger's voice interjected. "We've received word that someone in Fayetteville has been asking questions about missing women. The longer we wait, the greater the risk of exposure." Charity's heart raced as she realized they were discussing her immediate fate. Someone in town had noticed the pattern of disappearances and was investigating. The network was preparing to eliminate the evidence, which meant accelerating her delivery and subsequent disposal. She heard footsteps approaching her room and quickly feigned sleep, controlling her breathing despite the panic coursing through her veins. The door opened slowly, and she could sense multiple figures entering. Through barely opened eyes, she could see Whitlow carrying a medical bag, Fletcher with his familiar trembling hands, and a third man she had never seen before. Tall, broad-shouldered, with the bearing of someone accustomed to violence. "The sedative should take effect within minutes," Fletcher whispered as they approached her bedside. "But I want it noted that I'm acting under duress. This violates every principle of medical ethics." "Your principles are noted and irrelevant," Whitlow replied coldly. "Administer the injection." As Fletcher approached with a syringe, Charity made a split-second decision that would save her life. Instead of continuing to feign sleep, she suddenly sat up and spoke directly to the doctor in a voice loud enough to carry throughout the mansion. "Dr. Fletcher, I'm experiencing severe contractions. I think the baby is coming naturally right now." The unexpected development threw the three men into confusion. Fletcher dropped the syringe, which shattered on the wooden floor. Whitlow's carefully controlled expression cracked, revealing the cold fury beneath his genteel facade. The stranger reached inside his coat, presumably for a weapon, but hesitated when Charity cried out again in apparent agony. "The labor appears to be genuine," Fletcher said after a hasty examination, his medical training overriding his fear. "The contractions are regular and strong. We may not need to induce after all." What none of them realized was that Charity had been secretly timing false contractions for hours, preparing for exactly this moment. Her performance was convincing enough to force them into their prepared protocol, but early enough to potentially disrupt their carefully laid plans. As the men prepared for an immediate delivery, Charity caught sight of something that filled her with both hope and terror. Through her bedroom window, she could see lights moving along the main road, multiple torches or lanterns approaching Rosemont in the pre-dawn darkness. Someone was coming, and given the hour and the number of lights, it wasn't a social call. Whitlow noticed the lights at the same moment. His face went pale, and he turned to the stranger with barely controlled panic. "How much time do we have?" he demanded. "Maybe 30 minutes before they reach the house," the man replied, peering through the curtains. "Looks like a sheriff's party. Maybe 6 or 8 men. Someone must have talked." The revelation that law enforcement was approaching Rosemont transformed the entire dynamic. Whitlow's operation, so carefully concealed for years, was finally facing exposure. But instead of surrender, he chose escalation. "Prepare the emergency protocol," he ordered the stranger. "Fletcher, you have 15 minutes to complete the delivery. After that, we implement complete containment." Charity didn't need to ask what complete containment meant. They were planning to eliminate all evidence of their crimes, which undoubtedly included killing her, her unborn child, and anyone else who could testify against them. As Fletcher reluctantly began preparing for a forced delivery, Charity noticed that Mrs. Donovan had appeared in the doorway. The elderly housekeeper's face was streaked with tears, and she was wringing her hands in obvious distress. "Mr. Whitlow," she said in her thick Irish accent, "I cannot be part of this anymore. That girl is barely more than a child herself, and what you're planning, it's murder, plain and simple." "Your conscience is noted, Mrs. Donovan," Whitlow replied without looking at her. "But you'll continue following orders, or you'll join the subjects in Wilmington. The choice is yours." The threat against Mrs. Donovan revealed another layer of Whitlow's control. Even his household staff were prisoners, kept in line through fear and threats against their own safety. But it also suggested that the housekeeper might be an unexpected ally if Charity could find a way to communicate with her. As the approaching lights grew brighter and the sounds of horses became audible, the tension in the room reached a breaking point. Fletcher's hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold his instruments. The stranger was positioning himself near the window with his weapon drawn. Whitlow was pacing like a caged animal, his carefully cultivated refinement finally cracking under pressure. "Dr. Fletcher," Charity said, her voice carrying clearly in the tense silence. "Before you proceed, I think you should know that I've already documented everything. The ledger books, the correspondence, the names and dates in the cellar. I've recorded it all." It was a desperate bluff, but it had the intended effect. Fletcher stopped his preparations and stared at her in shock. Whitlow spun around, his pale eyes blazing with fury. "What did you say?" he demanded. "I said I've documented your entire operation," Charity repeated, meeting his gaze with defiant courage. "Every transaction, every victim, every contact in your network, and if anything happens to me, that information will be delivered to the authorities." The bluff was partially true. She had seen the documents and memorized key details, but she had no way to deliver information to anyone. However, the approaching lawman suggested that someone else had already gathered enough evidence to warrant an investigation. Whitlow's reaction was swift and violent. He struck her across the face with enough force to knock her back against the pillows, but the blow only strengthened her resolve. "You foolish girl," he snarled, his cultured accent slipping to reveal something far more sinister beneath. "Do you think your pathetic attempts at heroism will save you? I've been perfecting this operation for 8 years. No one has ever escaped, and no one ever will." But even as he spoke, the sound of horsemen reached the front steps of Rosemont. Voices called out in the darkness, official voices demanding entry in the name of the law. The stranger moved to the window and cursed under his breath. "Sheriff's party, plus what looks like federal marshals," he reported. "Someone's given them enough evidence to warrant a full investigation." The revelation that federal authorities were involved suggested that Whitlow's network had attracted attention at the highest levels. Human trafficking across state lines was a federal crime, and the involvement of marshals meant this wasn't just a local investigation. Mrs. Donovan suddenly stepped forward, her tear-streaked face transformed by unexpected courage. "It was me," she declared, her Irish accent thick with emotion. "I sent word to my nephew in Fayetteville. He works for the courthouse, and he knew how to reach the proper authorities. I couldn't watch another innocent girl disappear into that hellish cellar." Whitlow turned on her with murderous rage, but before he could act, the front door of Rosemont exploded inward. Heavy boots thundered across the marble floors as armed men spread throughout the mansion. Shouts echoed through the corridors as the lawmen began their systematic search. "This ends now," Sheriff Thomas Crawford announced as he burst into the bedroom, his pistol drawn and his badge gleaming in the lamplight. Behind him came 2 federal marshals and several deputies, their faces grim with determination. The stranger reached for his weapon, but found himself facing 6 armed lawmen who had no intention of allowing him to draw. Fletcher simply collapsed into a chair, his face buried in his hands as the weight of his crimes finally overwhelmed him. Only Whitlow maintained his composure, though his pale eyes burned with frustrated fury. "Gentlemen," he said, attempting to regain his cultured demeanor, "I'm afraid there's been some terrible misunderstanding. This young woman is my wife, and she's in the process of delivering our child. Surely this intrusion can wait until after." "Save your lies for the judge," Sheriff Crawford interrupted. "We've already found the cellar, Whitlow. We've seen the belongings, the records, everything, and we have testimony from survivors." The word survivors hit Charity like a physical blow. Mercy might still be alive, along with other women who had been presumed dead. The investigation was far more advanced than anyone had realized. As the lawmen secured the scene, Dr. Fletcher looked up from his hands and spoke in a broken voice that carried throughout the room. "I'll testify," he said quietly. "I'll tell you everything. The network, the contacts, the locations where they keep the women. I can't carry this burden anymore." His confession would prove to be the key that unlocked the entire conspiracy. But first, Charity needed immediate medical attention from someone who wasn't complicit in her attempted murder. The next hours passed in a blur of controlled chaos as federal authorities transformed Rosemont from a house of horrors into a crime scene of unprecedented scope. While a legitimate doctor from Fayetteville attended to Charity's genuine labor, which had progressed rapidly due to the stress of the evening's events, teams of investigators systematically documented every aspect of Whitlow's operation. The hidden cellar yielded evidence that exceeded even the most dire expectations. Beyond the personal belongings of 7 murdered women, investigators discovered detailed records of a human trafficking network that stretched from North Carolina to Georgia, Virginia, and South Carolina. The operation had been generating thousands of dollars annually through the sale of infants to wealthy buyers, and the trafficking of young women to brothels and private buyers throughout the region. But the most shocking discovery came when investigators followed Dr. Fletcher's directions to a warehouse in Wilmington. There, in conditions that defied human dignity, they found 12 women imprisoned in what could only be described as a breeding facility. Among them was Mercy Goodwin, alive but severely traumatized after months of captivity. The reunion between the sisters took place 3 days later in a hospital room in Fayetteville, where Charity was recovering from the birth of her son, a healthy baby who would never know the horrors that had nearly claimed his life. Mercy's physical recovery would take weeks, but her psychological scars would require much longer to heal. "I thought you were dead," Charity whispered as she held her sister's trembling hands. "When they told me you died in childbirth." "They told me the same about you," Mercy replied, her voice hollow with remembered trauma. "They said you had complications and didn't survive. They use that lie to break our spirits, to make us believe we have nothing left to fight for." The scope of Whitlow's deception was breathtaking in its cruelty. By convincing each victim that their loved ones were dead, he eliminated hope and reduced resistance. Women who might have fought desperately to return to family members instead succumbed to despair and accepted their fate as breeding stock for his network. Dr. Fletcher's testimony revealed the full extent of the operation's sophistication. Whitlow had established himself as a respectable businessman whose wealth and social standing provided perfect cover for his crimes. He cultivated relationships with corrupt officials who could falsify death certificates and manipulate records. He maintained contacts throughout the region who could transport victims and find buyers for both women and children. The network had operated with such efficiency that they processed dozens of victims annually. Young women who disappeared were officially recorded as having died in childbirth or from various illnesses. Their babies were sold to buyers who believed they were adopting orphans from legitimate sources. The women themselves were transported to facilities where they were kept alive for breeding purposes until they were no longer useful, at which point they simply vanished entirely. Whitlow's method of victim selection was particularly sinister. He specifically targeted women who were isolated by circumstance, orphans, widows, immigrants with no local connections. He presented himself as a generous suitor offering rescue from desperate situations, making his victims grateful for attention that was actually the beginning of their nightmare. The trial that followed became one of the most sensational criminal cases in North Carolina's history. Whitlow's network implicated prominent citizens in multiple states, leading to arrests that reached into the highest levels of society. Wealthy buyers who had unknowingly purchased trafficked children faced prosecution for their roles in the conspiracy. Corrupt officials who had falsified records were stripped of their positions and sentenced to prison. Dr. Fletcher's cooperation with authorities earned him a reduced sentence, but he would spend the rest of his life haunted by his complicity in the deaths and suffering of dozens of innocent people. His detailed testimony provided prosecutors with the evidence needed to dismantle the entire network and ensure that its surviving victims received justice. Mrs. Donovan's courage in contacting authorities was recognized as the key factor that brought down the operation. Her nephew's connections in the courthouse had provided access to federal marshals who specialized in investigating human trafficking cases. Without her willingness to risk her own safety, Charity and countless other women would have disappeared without a trace. The warehouse in Wilmington yielded additional horrors that shocked even experienced investigators. Women who had been imprisoned there for years described a systematic program of forced breeding, medical experimentation, and psychological torture designed to break their spirits and make them compliant. Those who resisted were subjected to punishments that often resulted in permanent injury or death. The facility also contained detailed records of buyers throughout the region, including prominent families who had purchased children and wealthy men who had bought women for private use. The network's client list read like a directory of Southern society, revealing that Whitlow's operation had penetrated the highest levels of respectability. As the investigation expanded, additional facilities were discovered in Charleston, Norfolk, and Savannah. The scope of the network was so extensive that federal authorities estimated it had trafficked hundreds of women and children over the course of nearly a decade. The economic impact alone was staggering. Investigators calculated that the operation had generated over $50,000 in illegal profits, a fortune equivalent to millions in modern currency. Jeremiah Whitlow was executed by hanging on December 15, 1840, after being convicted on 17 counts of murder, kidnapping, and human trafficking. He maintained his innocence until the end, claiming that he was simply a businessman who had been misunderstood by a society that couldn't appreciate his vision of human improvement through selective breeding. His execution drew crowds from across the region, with many of his victims' families traveling hundreds of miles to witness justice being served. Among those present were Mercy and Charity Goodwin, who had spent months testifying in various trials and helping authorities locate other victims throughout the network. The sisters' survival and courage in exposing Whitlow's crimes made them celebrated figures in the fight against human trafficking. Their story was published in newspapers throughout the country, serving as both a warning about the dangers faced by vulnerable women and an inspiration for others who might find themselves in similar circumstances. Charity's son, whom she named Thomas in honor of Sheriff Crawford, grew up knowing the full story of his dramatic birth. He would later become a prominent lawyer, specializing in cases involving crimes against women and children, dedicating his life to ensuring that predators like Whitlow could never again operate with impunity. Mercy eventually married a kind minister from Fayetteville who helped her heal from her traumatic experiences. Though she never fully recovered from her months in captivity, she found purpose in working with other survivors and advocating for better protection of vulnerable women. Her own child, a daughter who had been recovered from Byers in Virginia, was reunited with her mother through the efforts of federal investigators. The Rosemont estate was sold to pay restitution to Whitlow's victims and their families. The mansion itself was eventually torn down after local residents complained that it had become a morbid tourist attraction. The land was divided and sold to local farmers who gradually erased all traces of the horrors that had occurred there. Dr. Fletcher served 8 years in prison before being released on condition that he never practice medicine again. He spent his remaining years working as a clerk in a small-town pharmacy, living quietly with the weight of his crimes. He died in 1857, reportedly still haunted by nightmares about the women and children whose suffering he had enabled. Mrs. Donovan was awarded a substantial reward by federal authorities for her role in exposing the network. She used the money to return to Ireland, where she lived comfortably for the rest of her life. Her nephew, who had initially contacted the authorities, became a respected court official who specialized in investigating crimes against women. The broader investigation into Whitlow's network led to convictions of over 30 individuals across 5 states. The case established important legal precedents for prosecuting human trafficking and forced federal authorities to develop new methods for investigating crimes that crossed state boundaries. The impact of the case extended far beyond the courtroom. The revelations about how easily respectable society could hide such monstrous crimes led to reforms in how missing persons cases were investigated and how death certificates were verified. The network's sophisticated use of legitimate business connections as cover for criminal activity changed how authorities approached white-collar crime investigations. For the survivors, recovery was a long and difficult process. Many of the women rescued from Whitlow's facilities struggled with physical and psychological trauma that would affect them for the rest of their lives. Support networks developed organically as survivors found strength in sharing their experiences and helping each other heal. The case also highlighted the particular vulnerability of women who lacked family connections or financial resources. Reform advocates used the Whitlow case to push for better legal protections for orphans, widows, and immigrants who were often targeted by predators because of their isolation. Years later, as Charity sat in her comfortable home, watching her son play with his children, she would often reflect on how easily her story could have ended differently. The courage of one Irish housekeeper, the guilt of one corrupt doctor, and the persistence of federal investigators had combined to save her life and expose a network that might otherwise have continued operating for years. The official records of the case, including detailed testimonies from survivors and documented evidence of the network's operations, were sealed for 50 years to protect the privacy of victims and their families. When they were finally opened to researchers in 1890, they provided historians with unprecedented insight into the hidden crimes that flourished in antebellum American society. But perhaps the most lasting impact of the Whitlow case was its demonstration that even the most sophisticated criminal enterprises could be brought down by the courage of ordinary people willing to risk everything for justice. Mrs. Donovan's decision to contact authorities, Dr. Fletcher's eventual cooperation with investigators, and the Goodwin sisters' determination to survive and expose the truth had combined to save countless lives and deliver justice for the dead. The story of Mercy and Charity Goodwin serves as a reminder that in the darkest corners of American history, human trafficking and exploitation flourished under the protection of wealth, respectability, and social isolation. But it also demonstrates that justice, though sometimes delayed, could still be achieved through the combined efforts of brave individuals willing to fight for what was right. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed about Whitlow's network? Or might there have been other facilities and victims that were never discovered? Leave your comment below and share your thoughts about this dark chapter in American history. If you enjoyed this tale of survival and justice, subscribe to Liturgy of Fear, hit that notification bell, and share this video with someone who appreciates stories of courage in the face of unimaginable evil. The truth about our past, no matter how disturbing, deserves to be told and remembered.